Hey everyone, I never imagined I'd be sharing my life on the internet, but here we are. My wife, Emma, and I have been together for a decade, 8 of those years spent as a married couple. We met in college, and she was my first and only love. I thought we had something special, something rare, being each other's firsts and all. But it turns out, I was the only one who felt that way. A while back, Emma started working at a new company. Initially, she had a hard time fitting in, which wasn't surprising since she's always been on the shy side. After some encouragement from me, she eventually made friends with a group of women. Some were single, others divorced or casually dating, but none were married like us. At first, I was thrilled that she'd found a social circle. However, things started to change when she began going out more, drinks after work, late-night parties, and other outings organized by her new friends. It wasn't long before I noticed her behavior shifting. I wanted to talk to her about it, but I didn't want to come off as controlling. Then, things took a turn in our bedroom. Emma was never one to initiate intimacy, but after she started spending more time with her new friends, she was either too tired or just not in the mood. Around the same time, her company hired a new manager, someone Emma and her friends seemed to admire a lot. She'd mention him here and there, but soon it escalated to the point where she'd talk about how he handled various situations, some of which didn't even seem work-related. When I asked her about her sudden fascination with this guy, she dismissed my concerns, saying I was overreacting. One day, out of the blue, Emma asked me if I ever regretted not having more experience with other women. I told her no because she was all I ever needed. I swear I saw a flicker of sadness in her eyes, but she quickly changed the subject. Not long after, she started bringing up the idea of an open marriage, suggesting it might add some excitement to our relationship. I was completely caught off guard. This wasn't the Emma I knew. She'd never shown any interest in anything remotely like this before. Initially, I refused, suspecting it had something to do with her new manager, but she denied it and said she just felt like she'd missed out on something in life. She claimed she didn't want to lose me and thought this was a safe way to explore those feelings. I was naive and stupidly agreed, thinking we could set some boundaries and everything would be fine. So, we laid down some ground rules, mainly, no sleeping with others in our home. For the next year, Emma went on dates, had flings, and eventually found herself in a relationship with that manager. Meanwhile, I went on a few dates myself, but nothing more, because it just didn't feel right to me. Emma would occasionally check in to see if I was okay, but her behavior never really changed. That special, innocent love I once had for her started to fade, and it was eating me alive. Eventually, I went on a date with an incredible woman who had recently moved from South Korea. Our conversation flowed effortlessly. She was sharp-witted and had a smile that could make anyone forget their troubles. One thing led to another, and we ended up in bed together. Honestly, I never knew sex could be so fulfilling, so intoxicating. This woman made me feel desired in a way Emma hadn't in years. At first, Emma thought my new relationship was cute. But as the months went by, she began to question it. I reminded her that this was all her idea, and besides, she was already in a relationship with her manager. She fell silent, looking like she wanted to say something but couldn't. That's when things really started to change. She began coming home early, cooking dinner, cleaning the house, and even bringing lunch to my office. She also started initiating sex again, something she hadn't done in what felt like forever. But the truth is, by then, something inside me had died. I barely responded to her advances, and when I did, it was just to get it over with. The love I once had for Emma was gone, and I think she knew it too. One night, as we sat down for dinner, I asked Emma what had brought on this sudden change in her behavior. Why was she acting like the wife I used to know? She looked at me with those wide, pleading eyes and said she just wanted to show me that she still loved me, that she was happy with me. But I couldn't help it, I burst out laughing. I asked her what had happened to all those nights out with her friends, her manager lover, and the random hookups she'd been having. She didn't say anything, she just stared at her plate and eventually went to bed in tears. The next day, when I got home, Emma was waiting for me, looking more vulnerable than I'd ever seen her. She told me she wanted to close our marriage, that the whole thing had been a terrible mistake. She said she regretted everything and wanted us to focus on each other again. I told her to be honest with me, to explain what had driven her to open our marriage in the first place. And wouldn't you know it, it was her group of friends who had planted the idea. They'd convinced her that she was missing out on life, that she hadn't had the same adventures they'd had because she'd been committed to me from such a young age. Then, when that new manager came into the picture, he apparently encouraged that kind of lifestyle, telling her to live freely. Things escalated from there, leading to an emotional affair that eventually became physical once our marriage was open. She tried to compare the experience to being drunk behind the wheel of a speeding car, thrilling and intoxicating, but ultimately terrifying when you realize the damage being done. Emma said she now saw how ridiculous it all was, how she never needed to compare herself to anyone else, and that what we had was unique and special. But she also admitted that she felt like she had murdered our marriage, destroying any chance of us having a future together. I looked at her and told her straight up, I didn't think I'd ever be able to see her as my wife again. She broke down in front of me, sobbing uncontrollably. I just stood there, not really knowing what to do. Eventually, I wrapped my arms around her and held her until she cried herself to sleep on the couch. After that, Emma quit her job, cut off all contact with her friends, and even blocked the manager on every platform imaginable. She told me she was willing to do whatever it took to make it up to me, that she'd work her fingers to the bone to be seen as my wife again. But by then, it was too late. I hadn't ended things with the woman I'd been seeing, and honestly, I didn't want to. She made me feel like a man again, something Emma hadn't done in a long time. Truth be told, I was lost. I didn't know what to do. A part of me wanted to try and get back that special feeling with Emma, but another part of me felt like it was gone forever. The woman I'd fallen in love with had changed, and I wasn't sure if I could ever truly forgive her for what she'd done. We started marriage counseling a few days later. The therapist seemed nice enough, experienced, and genuinely eager to help. Even though it was only our first session, Emma poured her heart out, confessing everything, the influence of her friends, her doubts about missing out on life, and how the manager had encouraged her to explore this new lifestyle. She admitted that the whole experience was blinding and lacked the substance of what we had built together over the years. The therapist pointed out that comparing herself to others was dangerous, especially when those others were divorced or unmarried. Emma agreed, saying that when the new manager started flirting with her, her friends encouraged her to see where it goes, insisting that it was her chance to explore. But the guilt had eaten away at her, so she didn't let anything physical happen, at least, not until one of her divorced friends suggested the idea of an open marriage as a loophole. That's when the real damage started. As she spoke, I could see the regret in her eyes. She said she'd noticed the hurt in my eyes too, but told herself that this was all just part of her adventure. She swore she'd never forgive herself for it. But the real kicker came when she started to notice a change in me, how I'd smile more often for no reason, how my eyes would light up when I got a text message, or how I'd cheerfully leave the room to take a call. It was then that the gravity of what she'd done began to sink in. Emma said she started having panic attacks, realizing that someone else, my lover, was making me happy in ways she hadn't in years. When she went back to her friends for advice, they brushed off her concerns, saying it was normal for me to feel that way during this adventure. But when the friend who had suggested the open marriage in the first place told Emma that it looked like my lover was making me truly happy, that's when it all hit her like a ton of bricks. That night, Emma knew she'd made the biggest mistake of her life. She said she wanted nothing more than to win me back, but she wasn't sure if it was even possible anymore. After that therapy session, I didn't share much of my side of the story with the counselor. I did, however, mention that I hadn't cut ties with my lover, and the therapist was quick to point out that no resolution could be reached as long as she was still in the picture. She suggested we book another session for the next day. The therapist made it clear that while staying with your first and only partner is unusual, it's not impossible to weather such storms. I got the impression that she wanted us to be one of her success stories. But honestly, I wasn't sure if there was anything left to save. As the days passed, I found myself thinking more and more about my lover. She made me feel alive, like I could take on the world. It was a feeling I hadn't experienced in years. Emma, on the other hand, was spiraling. She could sense that I was slipping away from her, and it drove her to the edge. The more she tried to hold on, the more I wanted to let go. Things came to a head when I decided to move out. My brother, Adam, owned some properties and offered me one of his apartments at a ridiculously low price. I refused to stay for free, but it was still a good deal. I needed space, time to think. The apartment became my refuge, a place where I could escape the suffocating guilt and confusion that now filled our home. During one of our therapy sessions, I finally asked Emma some of the questions that had been gnawing at me. The first thing I wanted to know was whether anything physical had happened between her and the manager before we opened the marriage. She hesitated, staring at the floor, and begged me not to make her say it. I pushed her, needing to hear the truth. That's when she admitted that while they hadn't had sex, they had engaged in something equally intimate, they had touched themselves in front of each other. Hearing that was like a punch to the gut. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Even the therapist looked shocked. Emma started shaking, tears streaming down her face as she apologized over and over again. She even got on her knees, hugging my legs, pleading for forgiveness. But at that moment, all I felt was emptiness. Next, I asked her what had really changed her view of the manager. What had made her see him for what he really was. Emma explained that after she started pulling away from her toxic group of friends, the manager's behavior towards her changed. One evening, she overheard him talking to another colleague. He was bragging about how easy it had been to get her, how she was proof that you can't trust the quiet ones. When the colleague asked if he had feelings for her, the manager laughed and said she was just a pleasant distraction. He made it clear that he had no intention of leaving his fiancée, the only woman who truly understood him. He even said he felt a little bad for me, but, you snooze, you lose. That conversation shattered Emma. Realizing she had been nothing more than a cheap thrill to him was devastating. She left work that day, threw up in the parking lot, and drove home in a daze, wondering how she had let it come to this. She told me she was so overwhelmed with guilt that she became suicidal, thinking, "What have I done?" and begging me in her mind to forgive her. Finally, I asked Emma if she had ever loved him, and when she stopped loving me. Her answer cut deeper than anything else. Through her tears, she said she had never stopped loving me, that she had just been chasing something different. She thought what she felt for the manager was love, but now she realized how foolish she'd been. She gripped my arm and said she missed us, that she wanted to move away and start fresh, just the two of us, like it was meant to be. I told her it wouldn't be fair to my lover, that I needed time away from her to process everything. At those words, she completely broke down, sobbing uncontrollably and clinging to me like I was about to vanish. It took both me and the therapist a long time to calm her down. Eventually, the therapist convinced her that maybe time apart would help us heal. But things didn't end there. When we got home, as I was packing up my things, Emma received a video call on her laptop. It was one of her former friends, crying hysterically. Apparently, after Emma resigned, this friend and the manager had started an affair of their own. The friend had a pregnancy scare, which caused the manager to show his true colors. He accused her of trying to trap him with a baby, and her boyfriend found out about the affair after discovering some emails between the two. Her life was falling apart, and she was desperate for advice. She reached out to Emma, thinking she had somehow managed to save our marriage and hoping for a lifeline. I couldn't take it anymore. I just turned and left, heading back to the apartment where I could finally breathe. After moving into the apartment, I started to regain some sense of control over my life. The space gave me the clarity I needed, away from the constant reminders of what Emma had done. But even in this new environment, the pain lingered. I couldn't shake the memories or the emotions that came with them. After that day, things moved quickly. Emma continued her attempts to reach out, but I kept my distance. I focused on work, on rebuilding some sense of normalcy in my life, even as everything felt like it was falling apart. Our final counseling session came sooner than I expected. Emma was still clinging to the hope that we could somehow salvage our marriage, but I had already made up my mind. I told the therapist that I wasn't sure I could ever trust Emma again, that the love we once had was irreparably damaged. Emma broke down again, pleading with me to give her one more chance, but I remained resolute. The therapist suggested that we take some time apart, and I agreed, though in my heart, I knew that this separation would be permanent. A few days later, I met with a divorce lawyer. My brother had recommended someone who was experienced and straightforward. We discussed my options, and the lawyer advised me to move forward with the divorce. He said it was clear that the marriage was over and that dragging it out would only prolong the pain for both of us. When I served Emma the divorce papers, she was devastated. She cried, begged, and tried to convince me that we could work things out, but I was done. There was no going back. I told her that this was the best decision for both of us, that we needed to move on and start fresh, separately. She didn't take it well, but eventually, she accepted it, or at least, she pretended to. In the weeks that followed, Emma moved out of our house and into a small apartment on the other side of town. She cut off contact with her former friends and tried to start over, but it was clear that she was struggling. I heard through mutual acquaintances that she was seeing a therapist and trying to rebuild her life, but I didn't reach out. I needed to focus on myself, on healing and moving forward. As for my lover, things between us eventually fizzled out. While the connection we had was strong, it was born out of a tumultuous time in my life. Once the dust settled, I realized that what I needed most was to be alone for a while, to figure out who I was outside of my marriage and the chaos that had followed. Looking back, I've learned a lot from this experience. I learned that love isn't always enough, that trust, communication, and respect are just as important. I realized that people can change in ways you never expect, and that sometimes, no matter how much you want to hold on, the best thing you can do is let go. If I had one piece of advice for anyone going through something similar, it would be this: trust your instincts, but also trust yourself to know when it's time to move on. Holding on to something that's already broken will only hurt you more in the end. It's okay to grieve, to feel angry and betrayed, but eventually, you have to pick up the pieces and start over. And when you do, you might just find that there's a whole new life waiting for you on the other side.
Dear listeners, thank you for your incredible support and for tuning into my stories on YouTube. Your enthusiasm and feedback mean the world to me. Stay tuned for more exciting tales. Warm regards.